Okay, so as we begin the final chunk of the course here, we're going to begin, again, kind of building on some of the things that we've learned, taking kind of the first steps towards the last steps, if that makes any kind of sense, in terms of talking about what kinds of management activities and practice might we kind of encounter as a whole. And one of the kind of the big ones talk a lot about these days is this notion of restoration and wildlife restoration and what that actually means. And so we'll talk kind of a little bit about some of the basics of it, some of the, again, as usual, the things to be concerned about, ideas to consider about in terms of how to make your plan, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so in theory, here we go. Obviously, we'll go through each of these chapter objectives. I'm not going to talk about them individually. Slides up here, you can pause it if you kind of want a roadmap of where we're going. Basically, when we talk about wildlife restoration, it's like everything else we've talked about. I feel like I've said this probably every single time we've come together. It's a synthetic kind of a concept. It requires you to know a little bit about a lot of different things, right? It is very much in this interdisciplinary approach kind of framework. And honestly, that's just science in the 21st century. It's not anymore where you could go be a geologist and just learn rocks, or you could be an ecologist and learn about how, deer eat leaves. Everything is now so tied in because of our understanding of how science is all tied in. So you do need to know, obviously, some ecology here, some basic population ecology, a little bit of genetics. We're not going to cover genetics, but you need to understand a little bit, maybe hear about some of the interbreeding of populations. That's really what this comes into. Dynamics, so how the ecosystem is changing through time. Does it have a cycle? That kind of stuff. What did it used to look like? What are the possibilities here, right? So geology and soils really give us an indication for what the possibilities for what we can do are. They set limits on what is possible in terms of changing things. Getting into dynamics here a little bit, things like fire history, climatic patterns, all that kind of stuff is really going to feed into what you do. So before you begin doing in this restoration activity, right, you're going to need to have kind of a broad net survey from a lot of different fields, probably a lot of different workers, kind of giving you some information about what you're getting into. As far as definitions go, right, obviously restore means to bring back, right? But what are we actually going to be bringing back, right? This is the first most important question to ask. What are we restoring, right? You're given a job, client comes in and says, I want you to do some restoration on this ecosystem. You say, okay, great. To what, right? Do you want it to be 10 years ago? Do you want it to be 100 years ago? Do you want it to be pre-human contact? What are we aiming for, right? That's the first question. And it's not a trivial question. It's a really vastly important question to have to ask. And so really what you'll be doing here, right, is kind of a two-phase thing, and all we're going to do with those two phases is we're going to flip two words around. So we're going to begin with what's called restoration ecology, okay? And restoration ecology is where we figure out how to restore things, right? What's the theory? What's the sort of the higher level, top level science behind all this? And then we're going to flip that around and we'll do ecological restoration, right? And we're going to go from theory to practice. Okay, so this is the boots on the ground. This is you've got a shovel and a pickaxe and some seeds, right? This is you actually doing stuff. So restoration ecology is the theory, ecological restoration is the practice. All of this stuff is based around the concept of historical ecosystems, right? Which is basically what did things used to be, right? And these are going to be kind of your signposts or your guideposts for what you're restoring to. Okay, Are we shooting for something that was what was going on 100 years ago or 10 years ago? What do those things look like, right? So really here, what we're, I guess, ultimately trying to get is what's called a reference condition, okay? This is your goal. This is your preferred outcome. And so in order to define or come up with this reference condition, right, we need to do four things. We need to define the original condition, right, as compared to what it is now, okay? We need to figure out what happened to change the historical condition or the original condition to what it is now. We need to figure out what we're going to have to do in order to make now look like it used to look like, okay? And then we're going to have to finally ultimately come up with, okay, when do we know when we're done, right? When do we know when we've succeeded, okay? Or if we haven't fully met our goal, how do we know how close to success were we, right? All of that kind of stuff is kind of tied up in this reference condition. That reference condition, right, obviously can be of many different ages, right? It could be pre-human contact, which for this part of the world, right, might be 10,000 years ago, okay? It might be pre-European contact, which would be, a matter of a couple of hundred years ago. And the farther back in time you go, the harder that becomes, okay? For two reasons. Number one, the farther back in time you go, the more things have changed since then, okay? But also the farther back in time you go, the less sure we actually are about what it actually looked like, right? And so there's obviously kind of a back and forth to be made here. How close to original do you want to get? How close to original is it feasible? Is it possible to get to, right? Under all kinds of economic, sociological constraints. How expensive is it going to be? Are people going to be okay with some of the changes you're making, right? And the answer, honestly, is usually probably not. Okay, so first things first then, right? You got to figure out what's your historical reference. How far ago was it, right? And then once you figured out what kind of a time period you're looking for, now the trick becomes, well, what actually was going on then, right? What was the climate? What plants and animals used to live there, right? And as you do this, you might find that it is not going to be possible to do these things, right? There are going to be certain limiting factors that make it actually impossible for you to get 100% back the way things used to be. And so normally what's going to happen with this sort of thing is you'll get a client who will want a certain thing. You'll go out, you'll try to see, you'll survey, you'll get your assessment for what can be done, and then you need to walk them back a little bit. Now this can be an individual, this can be a private company, this can be a state or a federal agency, okay? But there's almost invariably going to be this walking back process of, okay, this is pie in the sky, this is what's realistic. How close to realistic are we going to actually shoot for, right? And those realistic goals are really kind of more about not restoring things exactly as they were, but really more about bringing them back to something that's a little bit better, right? A little bit more natural, a little bit less disturbed, a little bit less tampered with by human hand, so to speak. And so your key here, in terms of not only in terms of guiding your process, but also in terms of guiding how you work with your client, is defining what some acceptable limits are going to be, right? And again, ultimately, right, you're going to encounter cases where your client just wants something you can't deliver, right? The plants and animals that used to be there might be gone, right? And they might be relatively minor components, or they might be relatively major components of that ecosystem. And the more important, the more closer to a dominant or a keystone species those things are, the less likely it is that you're going to get there. On top of that, not only have a lot of things gone extinct, right, but there's also new things that have come in that are going to be hard, impossible, socially unacceptable, economically not feasible to remove, right? And so the loss of certain things, the gain of certain things, These two things can provide pretty big problems. Depending on the structure of the populations in question, right? They might heavily rely on dispersal, immigration, emigration, things like that. If the subpopulations in the metapopulation are now no longer connected, then maybe you can't restore it, right? If there's no way to get the animals that were there, say you're trying to restore something that ended up being a sink population for something. Not necessarily a bad thing or a wrong goal to have, but if they're no longer connected, it might be something you simply can't do, right? And then finally, we get to think, again, this is typically a sociological driven part. Sometimes these ecological processes that were in place in this habitat are no longer something that you can make happen. So here we think about fire ecology specifically. There are a lot of ecosystems and habitats that rely on fire. And as a result, without the ability to burn, you can't restore them. And the problem is that people tend not to like it when you burn things down. Sometimes you can get away with it and explain it as a vital process, but sometimes it's just not something you can happen. So again, thinking practically here, planning a restoration project requires that you know something about what's going on, okay? You have some idea here about what the historical conditions were. You know something about what the current conditions are. You know the species that you're working with, okay? How much can you change, right, before you make the ecosystem no longer a habitat, right? Can you legally do the things that you would like to do? That's not a minor thing. Sometimes it's simply coming up against something you're going to face legal challenges on. Believe it or not, right? This is kind of an example of how backwards we are right now. There will be circumstances where you will be legally prevented from doing restoration activities, right? And that all feeds into kind of this political reality that we're a part of right now. Okay, so we'll call it there. In the next video, the second of the two videos here we'll then actually come in and start thinking about some approaches to restoration, how we're actually going to accomplish the things that we've begun to set out a plan to do.